Hi. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about oral language as a foundation for learning. We've been talking in class a lot about cultural diversity and how that influences our interactions in the classroom. And we've also discussed the fact that language is a really important part of culture. And so it's worth exploring looking at the importance of oral language or a language system, not necessarily oral, but a language system is for academic activity and for building new knowledge. And unfortunately, I think there is often a limited understanding or a lot of assumptions people make about language diversity that often aren't based upon what the research really tells us about individuals who learn one or more languages. So let's talk a little bit about who English learners are and a little bit about second language acquisition. So just to kind of briefly review the demographic imperative for why it's so important that everyone understand some of these fundamental principles is because the English learner population in the United States is growing, and it's growing rapidly. In U.S. public schools in the year 2000, about 8.1 or a little over 8% of learners, or 3.8 million students, were English learners. By 2019, upwards of 9.5% of kids were English learners, and 4.9 million were needing some sort of support. So if you look, that's a large amount of growth, particularly in number of students over a relatively short historical period. Certainly we know that English learners are not evenly distributed throughout the United States, and so there are states with very few English learners, the lowest being West Virginia that has less than 1%, to California where more than 1 in 5 kids, or more than 20% of public school students, are so classified. Let's talk a little bit about the states with the largest number of English learners. I don't think you'd be surprised to know that Texas is near the top of that list. These are the states that, in rank order, that have 10% or more of kids classified as ELs. California is number 1. We talked about their numbers. Texas, 17.2%. And that just continues, that number continues to grow up, or that percentage also continues to go up. Nevada, almost 16%. New Mexico, over 13%. Colorado, almost 12%. Kansas is interesting because actually that's the state that's experienced the greatest growth in English learner population in the shortest period of time. And they're up over 11%. A lot of the explanation for that really involves the industries that people work in Kansas, and particularly the emphasis on agriculture. Washington State is over 11%, tied with Kansas. Alaska, 11%. Florida, over 10%. This is all data fairly recently released from the National Center for Educational Statistics. Okay, let's talk about some things that you might hear in schools related to language development, language acquisition. So I'm going to talk about some of these, and then let's kind of talk about what we think about them. So sometimes you will hear that speaking a language other than English interferes with English acquisition, and therefore doing any kind of instruction in the native language is really just a crutch. So the idea is if we put kids in all English early on, they'll pick it up, and if we rely on the native language, they're going to be slower to develop those English language skills. Kind of following that, there's also sometimes folks who say if you, particularly with very young children, immerse them in English, so those in preschool, kindergarten, they're really not going to need bilingual or ESL support for very long because they're in that period of peak language development. They're going to pick it up really quickly and carry right on. I don't know how many of you have heard this, but and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term code switching, or moving back and forth between languages. So someone who will begin speaking, say, in English and then use a few words in Spanish and maybe finish up in English, or vice versa. And I'm probably going to use Spanish as my example a lot. I fill in whatever language you want, but the majority of children we deal with in the Texas public schools will speak Spanish, although there are lots of other languages represented. But sometimes you hear that kids who go back and forth really don't have a dominant language, or they don't have a language proficiency. Another term that you're going to see a lot in the literature that's being discussed is translanguaging. a nuanced way of looking at the fluidity with which people move back and forth across languages. Um, you may have heard that parents of kids who are English learners should be encouraged to speak English at home. Again, the idea more English, faster acquisition, better performance in school. There are folks who say that individuals who speak non-standard English, so they may speak a dialect of English that we don't typically use in school, are actually using a substandard form of the language, so their language is not, say, as good as those who speak a more academic or formal register of English. We talked a little bit about who a language minority student is, but I want you to remember a student who is defined as language minority comes from a home or an environment where a language other than English is present. Sometimes those students are English proficient, sometimes they're not. But we always have to be aware that there is another language system operating in their environment and having an influence on their development. So language minority kids who converse well in English with peers, teachers, and others, but are struggling with academic work, maybe should be considered for a referral for special education because they appear to have the English skills necessary, but they're not able to use them in that academic, to enhance their own academic performance. And then the last one on this list, when English learners are identified as having a disability, their special education needs supersede or are more important than their language learning needs. So these are things that you may or may not have heard in school. I actually hope not, because they're all incorrect. I'm going to go back and talk a little bit more about that, but they are things that sometimes people do commonly say or believe, and I think it's real important that we know that those are not accurate assumptions and that we need to do what we can to build a culture in our school communities that's very cognizant of that. So on that first one, we know that actually speaking a language other than English doesn't interfere with English acquisition, and it actually supports it. So what the research says is the best predictor of how well you'll learn a second language is how well you know your first language. And so what that means is the stronger, more well-developed the native language is, actually the quicker we'll see kids acquire English. And one of the things that's interesting, I'm sure many of you have heard people say, well, you know, I've had these kids that have been here since kindergarten, their English still is not what it should be. And then we got a kid that just came from Mexico in 6th grade, and all of a sudden they've just taken off like gangbusters. Well, a lot of that may be because they had such well-developed native language skills, and they've also had academic content instruction in their native language. So always be sure you bear that in mind. This idea that very young children immersed in English are going to not need support is ridiculous. Yes, it's true that young children will take a lot of risk in terms of language that older learners won't. So you'll sometimes hear, you know, younger students are better learners. Well, where they're better is that usually the younger you are when you're exposed to a second language, the more likely you are to develop native-like pronunciation. So the example I always give is I have been exposed to Spanish, but not until I was in high school. I will never be able to trill my R's. If I had been exposed at an earlier age, I probably would be able to do that. And we know that little kids are used to making lots of mistakes with language, and so they're bigger risk takers. They're better risk takers, actually, in terms of being okay with trying and making a mistake. But there are also a lot of advantages that older children bring to that language learning process, and like I said, not the least of which is if they have very well-developed native language. So this idea of immersion and, you know, very limited need for language support is absolutely inaccurate. Code switching. So I'd be willing to bet there are some people listening to this video who code switch or around people who code switch. That is not always an indicator that someone has no language. Sometimes it's an indicator that someone has very highly developed skills in both languages, and they pick and choose because they can express themselves better for some purposes in one language than in another. And we all know that there are some terms that don't directly translate across languages, and so that may be a preference of the person as they're speaking. Parents of English learners should be encouraged to speak English at home. You know, I hope that we are beyond that or hearing that, although occasionally it comes out. So I want you to think about this. I'm going to assume that there's no one in our class who speaks Urdu, which is a language commonly spoken in parts of India. And so, if I said to you today, what I want you to do, your children are going to be going to school and they're going to be learning Urdu. So, the very best thing for you to do is go home and speak only Urdu as a family. I want you to think about what the implications of that would be for just a minute. What would probably happen is you'd provide a really poor model of Urdu because you don't speak it. And even if you really were committed and on your way home from work, you bought an Urdu English dictionary and you tried your very best, think about the quality of the conversation in your home and what's really going to be, you're going to be able to discuss. So, what we want parents to do is interact with their children, engage with their children, discuss everything that is important to them with their children. And if we ask parents to do that in a language they don't speak, we're really going to limit that conversation, and that is never what we want. I would say I have maybe intermediate receptive skills in Spanish. My expressive skills are not very good at all. Most of my Spanish I learned because I love to travel in Latin America. So I can ask, give me a check, where's the bathroom? I don't need to have those conversations with my children. But in Spanish, if you ask me to talk about education, which is my passion, or, my views about important topics in the world, I wouldn't be able to do that. So we don't want to limit what parents can expose their children to by specifying that they need to, have conversations in a language they don't speak. One of the things I really want everybody to wrap their head around is that if I learn the language of my home and community, I am a good language speaker. And from a linguistic point of view, language is language. One is not necessarily superior to another, okay? So I grew up in a family where, we was fixing to go get that over yonder, right? That wouldn't be an unusual thing to have heard in the family where I grew up. And I certainly spoke like that because that's the model that I had had. And that language system was, everybody understood it, could communicate in it, worked perfectly fine. So in that way, it wasn't substandard. It was just not the formal register that's often used in school, which I had to acquire, okay? But I do want you to remember, from a linguistic point of view, one is not necessarily better than the other because they're both language systems that enable communication. But often we make kind of pejorative assumptions about the languages that kids bring to school. And that can be true, whether it's a different language. So I want you to think about maybe some of the stereotypes that you have or that are commonly held about people who speak French. Which might be associated with, being very romantic, being very worldly, being very informed. And are those the same stereotypes that we have maybe about people who speak Spanish as their first language? Because we do make those kinds of assumptions. Well, my family is all from Louisiana, or most of them, and actually there are parts of Louisiana where speaking French is certainly not considered worldly or romantic or sophisticated, and it has a very different connotation. And again, it's not about the quality of language, it's about our own prejudices about those languages and the way that they're used, okay? That idea, and I think you all know this, we talked about the iceberg theory of language and culture. Kids can converse very well in English at a social level and not have the level of English skills that they need for academics, and that certainly does not indicate a disability, but it probably does indicate a need for additional language support. And then the last one, and I don't hear people say this anymore, but I see this play out. So sometimes when children are identified as having a disability and they're receiving bilingual or ESL services, you look and over time what happens is they're getting more and more special ed, and they may or may not any longer be receiving bilingual or ESL support. Sometimes that happens because people say, well, it's going to be scheduling, it's going to be hard, and special ed's more important. If you do that, that's absolutely illegal. Kids who are entitled to special ed, who are also entitled to bilingual and or ESL, should get both, right? Your need for one doesn't in any way influence your need for the other. But what I sometimes hear happen in a very subtle way is parents are told your child really needs the supports available in special education. So maybe what you want to do is deny services in ESL or bilingual. Please don't do that. Um, you're really oftentimes for a child who is an English learner who may have a disability, they're going to need more rather than less often support in terms of language acquisition, and they may very well need, you know, accommodations, modifications, support from special educators, but they're also going to still continue to be an English learner and need those other supports as well. Okay, let's talk a little bit about sort of legal underpinnings. I hope some of you have heard of the case of Lau versus Nichols, 1974, and that is the point at which the courts ruled that school districts have a duty to see that students who are not English speakers are not discriminated against, okay? And that it is not equal treatment under the law to provide students with the same facilities, textbooks, everything the same as what the English only speakers are receiving, because effectively then we're not giving them access to the curriculum. So think about it. If I sit all of you down and, you know, you're at a school in China and I say, well, I'm giving you what I'm giving everyone else, are you going to have the same access as a native Chinese speaker? Well, you know, obviously not. Okay. We talked about this already. So again, remember language minority students who come from homes and communities where a language other than English is present or spoken. There are many language, you know, we have a lot of people in our class who may indeed be those we would consider language minority. They're proficient in English, but they're still in an environment where they're frequently exposed to another language. We also have kids who are language minority who are English learners, and they have a first language other than or in addition to English and need either bilingual instruction or ESL support in order to have access and be successful in general education. Let's talk a little bit about program models. You're going to read about this. I've assigned you a reading by Chen that will help you to have a better understanding of these. Sometimes I find people throw out terms without really thinking about them. And one of the things that I want to make the point is that it is very important if you are considering a child for a referral to special education who's an English learner, it is critical that you know what model of bilingual and or ESL support they have been receiving. And let me restate that, because ESL should always be part of our bilingual program. If it's bilingual, our goal is, you know, using the native language but developing English, right? There are a number of different models of bilingual education. Most commonly in our area, I see what I would call an early exit or a transitional model, which is we use native language only enough to really get kids moving in English, and then we try to get them into English as quickly as possible. Often children who are in those kind of programs will eventually lose their native language, or they'll speak it conversationally, but they won't develop academic skills in that language. If we're doing developmental bilingual or late exit or maintenance programs, there the focus is on making sure that in addition to adding the English, we maintain the native language. And so we've talked about the fact that most of us would really like to be bilingual. Developmental or late exit programs are going to be more likely to make that a possibility, because I'm going to hold on and continue to use my native language while I'm adding the English on. And then common, effective model that we're seeing being used more in a number of places, unfortunately not as much in our area as many of us would like, is a dual language model, where we're actually using both the native language and English, or the two target languages. And again, the goal is to develop that full proficiency. Sometimes we have one-way programs, so the students all speak predominantly one language. Sometimes there are two-way programs, so we have students who are English speakers, and let's use Spanish as an example, and the English speakers are learning Spanish, and the Spanish speakers are learning English, and there's instruction in both languages. Many schools will do it Monday, Wednesday, Friday is Spanish, Tuesday, Thursday is English, and the next week that's reversed. And both groups are in the process of acquiring a language and supporting each other in that language development. But depending, many times you'll hear teachers say, well, this child's been in bilingual education for 3 or 5 or however many years, and so we know the problem that they're having is not language related. You have to know, what was the model, was it used consistently, and what kind of progress did that child make? Because we have a lot of students who move often, and they may flit in and out of a lot of different classrooms using a lot of different models of providing supports, and so that's going to be critical information for us to have. English as a second language programs, and remember, ESL is a program, not a person, provide intensive instruction to develop students' English proficiency. We know that we have programs that do what we call content-based ESL, which means that we're taking the curriculum that children are being exposed to and we're supporting English language development in the context of that curriculum. We also see some models implemented that are what we call pull-out ESL, and sometimes kids are working with ESL teachers for short periods of time during the day, primarily on functional communication. But I want you to remember, and we'll talk about it, but it takes a long time to acquire a second language to the point that you really have a proficiency level that's similar to that of a native speaker. And so one of the things that I think is real important is that everyone have some English as a second language strategies to use, because at some point we all teach children who are in that process of acquisition, and they're going to need language support in order to access the curriculum. All right, so let's talk a little bit about language acquisition in school and how this plays out. Virginia Collier, and actually along with Wayne Collier, developed this model, certainly not new, but I think it still plays, and I think it's real important to consider, is that simultaneously children are developing in a lot of different areas. They're developing in terms of their language skills, and those are increasing as they're exposed and have more opportunities to use language for meaningful purposes. Cognitive development is going on. They're developing more conceptual knowledge and understanding. And then they're being exposed to academics. And all of those things are happening simultaneously, and they all build upon one another. And then that's all filtered through the social and cultural processes that are happening. And that's where we have to really think about what's familiar for this child, in what ways am I affirming this child. And we talk some about additive and subtractive bilingualism. So are we sending the message that it's bad to use the native language, in which case we may actually interrupt some of that flow, right? Or are we sending the message, it's great that you have that and we're going to build on it? But just remembering that all that we do is part of this socio-cultural milieu, and we have to think about how are we supporting children via those social and cultural processes to develop across these areas. Okay. We talked a little bit about formal, or what some people refer to as academic English. Here's an example. I'd like to ask you to just think about this. Collisions between multi-charged ions with C60 fullerenes have received much attention since fullerenes became available in relatively large quantities. At low impact energy, single and multiple electron capture are the dominating processes. Contrarily to ion atom collisions, these collisions are characterized by very large multiple capture cross sections. I don't know how many of you now want to answer the comprehension questions about that, but that would certainly be an example of academic English. I want you to look at this example of French, and I don't know if anybody in our class speaks French, but just spend a few minutes with it and then think about whether you think this is an example of highly academic language. What do you think? For those of you who are non-French speaking, you may think this is very complex text, right? This is actually the Three Bears in French. It's a very simple story told to children. But again, we also have to think about not just the level of the text, but the level of access given an individual's language skills, right? All right, so let's talk a little bit about stages of second language acquisition. And one of the things that we know is children tend to progress through stages, right, of second language acquisition processes. And this is, this is for typical students who are in the process of acquiring a second language. The first phase is what we call pre-production or comprehension. Most kids will listen for a long time before they speak, or a relatively long time. We usually say, somewhere around 6 months to within 6 months to the first year. And if you think about that, there are many ways in which second language acquisition actually parallels first language acquisition. So one of the things we know about children acquiring their native language is they understand before they speak, right? So we can say to the baby, where's the dog? Where's your ball? We can open a book and say, point to various things in the pictures. And often very young kids can do that before they're actually using those words, right? Well, that same phenomenon exists with kids as they're learning a second language. I listen before I speak. Early speech production then is just beginning to use some short phrases. There's going to be lots of errors in those phrases, right? And then over time, we're going to see phrases get longer. We're going to see more complete sentences, fewer errors at that point that we're really seeing speech emergence going on. At the point of intermediate fluency, kids are able to use language for a variety of purposes, many of them academic, so being able to analyze, being able to defend a position or evaluate something more critically. All of those verbs that we see there would be something that would be within the realm of something that would be comfortable for someone at an intermediate level of fluency. At the point that someone is advanced fluent, their receptive and expressive skills are comparable to native speakers. Okay? And one of the things I want you to remember is we often view kids who are in the process of acquiring English as having this advanced level of fluency when they really do not. So if their language is not similar to that of a native speaker, then they're probably still going to continue to need some language supports and some scaffolds to make sure that they have access to the content. Okay? There's just a little more depth about this. Remember, sometimes pre-production is referred to as a silent period. It's at the point at which English learners are focusing on developing receptive skills and concentrating and paying attention to the nuances of how that new language works, right? We move there to early speech production. Very simple phrases emerge pretty naturally. 1- and 2-word utterances. Often, again, children are going to be making errors because they're not fully proficient, in the same way that little kids who are learning their native language also make errors in the beginning. Very, very common. And I do want you to think about that it's real important to think about how we respond to those errors. So if we have a little kid and the little kid says, we go to the store today, right? What do? Technically, there was an error in there. We goed, right? Hopefully what you're thinking is, well, what we do is say something like, you're right, we went to the store, right? Because what's happened at the point that that child says we goed, they're actually indicating that they have a tremendous amount of information about the English language. They've used past tense, but what they've done is they've hit an irregular verb and they haven't learned that exception to the rule, right? Someone who's in the process of acquiring English, even if they're in their, adulthood, may still make that kind of an error. And we wouldn't want to treat that significantly differently than we would with the young child, where we'd model it back. Now, obviously, as children advance through these stages of language acquisition, if skills like that become fossilized, then we do need to go in and work on those grammatical constructions. But it's not what we're going to do when they're first beginning to use language, right? Or put longer, more complex sentences together. As speech is emerging, just like when my children were little, I tried to keep a diary and write down, every new word they said for a long time. Well, sometimes, into somewhere between their first and second birthdays, it almost became impossible because they used so many new words in a day that I couldn't get them all down. That may also happen as someone's in the process of acquiring that second language. Wider range of vocabulary. More words are being used, right? And then again, at the point that they're hitting intermediate fluency, they're comprehending well. They're going to get, receptive comes first, they're going to be able to interpret most of the messages that they are hearing. They understand and use higher language again at higher, more abstract levels, often for academic purposes, but they're still going to make a few of those structural errors that are typical when we're in that process of developing language, right? And we don't hit that level of advanced fluency until both my receptive and my expressive skills are similar to a native speaker. My language is fluent and accurate. I can understand abstractions, metaphors, analogies, idioms. I can think of 10 ways to say something, right? I have that flexibility in my vocabulary, and I can understand and use language for academic purposes. At the point that I'm there, I do have advanced fluency. Does that mean I'm going to speak without an accent? No. Possibly, but maybe not. Maybe never. But an accent isn't a problem, and it's certainly not a disability. Okay? Some other concepts that I want you to be sure to remember. Literacy in first language transfers to literacy in second language. So if I have learned to read, no matter what language I learn to read in, that's going to support my ability to read in English because I know what reading is. I know how reading works, right? So I'll give you an example. Because I read English well, I could actually pick up a book written in Spanish right now, and I could sound like I'm an excellent reader in Spanish. My pronunciation won't be great, but I can read it aloud. It'd be okay. I wouldn't necessarily understand it, but the ability to actually decode and read would be there, right? So it's always a good thing. All those skills students bring in their native language are a positive. Second language learners must be having time to go through all of these stages of production. I can't necessarily skip some. I mean, I don't care what Berlitz program you take. No one is going to become an advanced fluent speaker of another language in 3 months. We know that typically kids in bilingual programs, means where they're getting support in the native language along with English, will acquire that conversational proficiency in a year or 2. And probably academic proficiency in 5 to 7 years. That's a guideline Jim Cummins gave us many years ago. We know that actually the kids in bilingual programs acquire English more quickly and more fully than kids in ESL only, where they don't have that native language support. And for those kids, many authors say now you're probably looking at 8 to 10 years to become English proficient. So in other words, if you don't have that native language support, it's actually going to take longer. And the time that's needed is always going to, vary from individual to individual, but it's strongly going to be influenced by a student's native language and literacy proficiency. Okay, now I want to talk a little about dialect, because dialect is one of those things, and again, some of the major issues are that it's pejorative, right? We view different dialects as being higher or lower status or indicative of a person's level of education, etc. So let's think about, do you speak American? Okay. So do you carry your groceries in a sack or in a bag? I put mine in a bag. Okay. Do you drink soda, pop, or Coke? So where I grew up, you might say somebody might say, do you want a Coke? And you'd say, yeah, Dr. Pepper would be great, because every soda water is called Coca-Cola. But that tends to be one of those words that really varies depending upon dialect. And certainly it's true, our dialect among many Americans is influenced by the part of the country in which we live. If you're standing on a corner and you're looking at the corner diagonal to you, is that kitty corner, catty corner, or diagonal? Often it's going to depend on where you grow up. Is it caramel or caramel? Is it aunt or aunt for, your mother's sister? What word do you describe use to describe a torrential downpour? So I grew up and heard it's raining cats and dogs. Well, obviously none of us have ever really seen cats and dogs falling from the sky, but that's a common expression, right, to describe it as really raining hard. I think the funniest one I've ever heard, and I hope this doesn't offend anybody, evidently in West Texas, there are people who will say it's a turd floater when it's raining really, really hard. So, again, those are issues associated with dialect, different terminology used in different places. You can look at people, British English and Australian English and U.S. English, very, very, very different in some ways. Some certainly some nuances and differences. I've given you a link to something that you can look at just for fun, and you can take a little dialect quiz, and then it'll predict some things about your exposure to languages. Okay. But one of the things I want you to remember is nobody really speaks standard English, because if we did, we'd all walk around sounding like textbooks, and we don't. We speak dialects of English. Usually, when I arrive somewhere, somebody knows pretty quickly, first time I say y'all, that I probably grew up in the southern United States, right? And if somebody says to me, "Yous guys," then I'm thinking you're somewhere from the Northeast. Okay. Again, the closest approximation to standard English is the formal register that we find in textbooks and grammar books. So think about it. That's a girl with whom she went to the park. You probably haven't heard somebody say that, right? That's the girl she went to the park with, but we wouldn't write that, okay? So again, it all depends on context. It all depends on what's appropriate for you in that setting and what your exposure has been. So, dialect is the language of a group of people that often will show regular variations from that of other groups of speakers of that language in terms of the lexicon, the actual words used, the syntax and grammatical structure, the phonology, the sounds. So think about if you hear someone from Boston, and I won't do this very well, but the ka, right? That AR sound is pronounced very differently. Or if you look at people from the South, I found it very difficult to teach kids the difference between the short E and the short I sound in Texas, because this is called a pin. And what I wear on my shirt, that's a pretty piece of decorative jewelry, is also a pin. We don't say pen, which they will in many parts of the country. That's a difference in phonology. Where the stress is on a word may vary, right, according to the dialect I speak or the intonation pattern that I use. People say in the South, we drag our vowels, right? We really stretch out those vowel sounds and lengthen them, and that's a common intonation pattern of someone who speaks with a Southern dialect. Okay, so is dialect are dialects of the language, are two dialects of the same language different? Yes. Are they different languages? No. But if you look, years ago, a movie came out called The Full Monty. I'm not necessarily recommending it to anybody, but the people in the movie spoke what is called a Cockney dialect of British English. It's English, but my husband spent the entire movie saying, "What did they say? Back it up." We were watching it on a tape, back it up. I didn't understand. These people were speaking English, but they were speaking a different dialect. But remember, a dialect, legitimate, rule-governed, mutually intelligible communication systems shared by groups of people. If they're not mutually intelligible, the systems are considered to be different languages. So I knew those people are speaking English. I'm going to have to work at it, but I can understand that language, as opposed to people speaking French, which I can't understand at all, right? While the definitions of language and dialect are widely accepted, they're not applied consistently. So for instance, you will hear people say when they're speaking about Chinese speakers, they speak the Mandarin dialect, or their dialect is Cantonese. Well, really, they are not mutually intelligible languages. They're actually completely different languages. So we need to think about using those terms appropriately and correctly, okay? So Texas dialects, we got our West Texas, our East Texas, our South Texas, our German Texas, our Czech Texas. There are people, we will talk a little bit more about African American English, which is a dialect spoken in some African American homes and communities. You'll hear the term Spanglish for Spanish-influenced English. And certainly that's an example of a dialect, but I hope that it wouldn't be used in a derogatory way. Okay. So dialects can be distinguished by factors including cultural group, the membership of my cultural group, my geographic location, my social class, my gender, my age. So I'll give you an example. Years ago, I had a student who was actually maybe spoke 4 or 5 languages. Xu Ying Chu. She was from Taiwan. And so one day I was giving essentially an alternative version of this very lecture I'm doing here today on this video. And I was saying, yeah, and then look at Xian. She speaks, so many languages. And one of the students went, props. And I went, yeah, Shuyin is my prop. And then they all started laughing. And I went home and told my children that, and they were horrified. Oh my gosh, Mom, you don't know what prop is? And I was like, or props? I was like, no, that's an age-related issue associated with dialect. So all those factors are going to influence how we speak, okay? So let's talk a little bit about African American English, or what we call African American Vernacular English. This is a dialect that's been frequently studied in the United States, right? And I want you to think about the fact and wrap your head around that African American English is a distinct, complex, rule-governed system, which means it's a good language featuring semantic and syntactic patterns that are different from school English. Doesn't mean not good, means different. Remember, different is not always, we're not going to place a value judgment on different, but often in schools that we do. So what AAE is a linguistic system. It is not incorrect, inferior, or slang form of English. So it is not non-standard English, because it is standard English in certain communities. It's not substandard English, because if it was substandard, it couldn't be used for communicative purposes, and it very much is. And it is not the language of hip-hop or rap, although some hip-hop and rap may indeed be produced, and African American English may be used there, but I've had teachers say, oh, that's just rap language. Well, it may be the language used in rap, but that's actually a form of English that's been used for many, many years historically by groups of people in our country, okay? And so the thing I want you to think about is that if kids come to school with an intact language system and they are speaking the language well of their home and community, they're good language learners. So they may need to learn a new language if they come in not speaking English, or if they're what we call a dialectical speaker, they may need to learn, in addition to their the dialect that they speak, to learn the language, the academic language dialect that we often use in school. But it doesn't mean that what they're bringing in is bad, wrong, or needs to be eliminated, okay? And so it's about our mental model of those languages. It's not about the value of them. And so I gave you some examples here. I'm not going to go through them, but I'm not going to narrate them, but I wish you would, of things people have said about language. Some of this is older, these quotes, but I think that they reflect things that you will still hear people say about dialectical speakers of English. So the children had no language. The language of culturally deprived children is not merely an underdeveloped version of standard English, but basically non-logical mode of expression. Well, again, it's not non-logical if I can use it and the people around me use it and we can all understand each other. Here's a couple of other examples that you might want to look at and think about. But one of the things I would tell you is that it is really important to make sure that we don't view children's native languages or their native dialects as a barrier to academic achievement. Those are some of those funds of knowledge that they bring to the classroom. They're things to be built upon, and they may be things to enhance, enrich. But again, it's not a barrier to anybody being able to learn and be successful to school. But teachers' attitudes about those language variations are way more important predictors of student achievement than actually the language the kids brings to school. And I think that's really important to wrap your head around. When teachers understand and they accept different language patterns and dialects, they are far less likely to make inaccurate judgments about ability based on kids' language characteristics. So please remember that. It's real important that I truly develop an understanding of these characteristics of second language acquisition or second dialect acquisition so that I don't inadvertently judge children's academic capabilities based on those language differences. Okay. Um, it is true that kids must achieve proficiency in standard English to fully participate in mainstream U.S. institutions. That tends to be true. To be successful, for instance, at the level that you all are operating in this course, you need to have a pretty strong foundation in standard formal English. But again, it doesn't mean that anything that you brought to the party is in any way deficient, but that we need to support you to acquire those skills, right? One of the things, I'll step back a minute because I'm at the end of this. I posted something called Are You an O'Cocker or a Dingbatter? Also in this unit folder. It's a little quiz. O'Cocker is a dialect of English spoken in the islands off of North Carolina, and what we call the Outer Banks. And so if I were you, I would open the quiz and just try it for yourself, and then you can look at the answers. And then again, I want to remind you, that's all English being spoken there. But some of those dialectical differences, if you went to Ocracoke and you were, communicating with others in that dialect, you'd probably need some support to be able to fully master, fully understand. Okay, thanks a bunch.